By the year 1900, European intellectuals operated under a comfortable assumption: human progress was a guaranteed upward trajectory. The religious conflicts and the Napoleonic campaigns were relics of the past, and a Hegelian spirit of perpetual advancement seemed secure. The outbreak of the First World War instantly erased that optimism. While 19th century European wars were often brief, localized affairs, the conflict of 1914 introduced a psychological and physical meat grinder. The introduction of trench tactics and chemical warfare forced the West into a landscape of mechanized attrition. The ensuing devastation left European societies vulnerable. In the immediate aftermath, Bolshevism, fascism, and Nazism rapidly took root, prompting scholars to ask if Western culture had triggered a terminal decline. British historian Arnold Toynbee responded to this trauma by examining the entire historical record. He wanted to determine if the West was doomed to disintegrate, much like the empires of antiquity. The result was a study of history, a staggering 12-volume analysis that functions as an autopsy report for dead societies. Toynbee was searching for the precise mechanical laws that govern civilizational death. To isolate these laws, Toynbee realized he had to discard the traditional boundaries of historical study. Looking at individual nations, specific races, or localized peoples offered too narrow a view. He argued that the proper unit of analysis is the civilization, a massive social ecosystem unified by its culture, institutions, and underlying mentality. Humans lived in scattered groups for tens of thousands of years, but within the last 6,000 years, Toynbee identified 23 distinct civilizations. On our species' biological scale, ancient Sumer and modern Europe are contemporaries. They are comparable entities, not links in a single chain. Because these 23 societies are structurally parallel ecosystems, their life cycles can be compared side by side. By observing them together, we can chart the repeating mechanisms that dictate how a civilization lives and dies. For most of human history, communities existed in a highly preservative state. Neolithic village life was governed by archetypal rituals, a dense cake of custom where daily actions rarely changed. A society breaks from this stasis through one specific mechanism: a severe environmental or social adversity. The community must innovate to survive, initiating a cycle of challenge and response. Early river valley civilizations emerged exactly this way. The need to manage regular, devastating floods in Egypt and Mesopotamia required astronomical observation, massive irrigation works, and a hierarchical city-state to organize the labor. But the adversity cannot be absolute. The Inuit communities of the Arctic successfully adapted to one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. Yet the challenge was so extreme that all their resources were consumed by basic survival, leaving no surplus energy for civilizational growth. Conversely, communities living in lush tropical environments where food and shelter are naturally abundant experience almost no friction. Without adversity, there is no pressure to innovate, and civilization never sparks. Toynbee defined the necessary balance as the golden mean. A society requires a challenge difficult enough to demand massive collective innovation, but not so brutal that it crushes the community entirely. Civilizations are never born from natural abundance. They are engines ignited strictly by the precise application of environmental and social friction. Real innovation is rarely the product of the collective. It requires a specific, isolated insight to break the cake of custom, meaning progress starts with the individual, not the crowd. Toynbee identified this leading edge as the creative minority. These individuals detach from society to confront a specific riddle. Once they achieve a breakthrough, whether technological, military, or spiritual, they return to share their innovation. The wider population rarely grasps the intellectual mechanics of a new solution. Instead, society advances through mimesis, adopting the innovation through ritualized imitation. Each successful response generates confidence, propelling society toward the next obstacle, scaling up and developing complex internal structures. A civilization remains alive and continues growing strictly as long as its masses willingly copy the creative solutions provided by its leadership. Growth ceases at a specific inflection point. The creative minority eventually loses its innovative spark and calcifies into a static, dominant minority. The leadership begins resting on past achievements. Institutions are preserved out of habit, and the dynamic rituals of society become hollow, mechanical routines. This rot is often accelerated by military victory. A dominant state organizes itself entirely around warfare, succeeding so profoundly that it atrophies into a rigid, conservative order hostile to new ideas. This breaks when the population realizes its leaders are merely exploitative. The masses withdraw their mimesis, abandoning the old drills. Without shared rituals, the social project evaporates. Individuals retreat into self-interested factions. A Roman patrician identifies solely as a wealthy landowner. This widespread disaffection births the proletariat, a massive underclass of people who physically live within the civilization but have emotionally and spiritually seceded from it. Civilizations are not murdered by external forces. They commit suicide the moment their leaders lose the capacity to inspire and are forced to rely on raw coercion. Once the breakdown begins, the civilization enters a centuries-long disintegration phase, violently fracturing into three distinct institutional forces. First, the panicked dominant minority tries to suppress the mounting chaos through sheer scale. They conquer their neighbors and centralize power to forge a universal state, like the Roman or Han empires. These massive empires project an aura of total control, but they are tragic illusions. They provide a temporary rally, delaying the inevitable collapse. Second, the alienated internal proletariat leverages the sprawling infrastructure of that empire, its common language and vast road networks to build a universal church. This world religion acts as a chrysalis. As the host civilization rots around it, the church preserves the cultural fragments necessary to eventually birth an entirely new society out of the ruins. Finally, there's the external proletariat. The communities on the borders realize the core society has become purely oppressive, and they abandon any desire to assimilate, instead organizing into heavily armed barbarian warbands. Sitting on the frontier, these warbands study the military strategies and technologies of the dominant minority. Eventually, they use those exact tools to overrun the empire, ushering in a dark age of raw barbarism. Sprawling, continent-spanning empires and massive world religions are not signs of peak historical health. They are the unmistakable symptoms of a civilization in its death throes. Looking at the data, Toynbee laid this 6,000-year mechanical framework directly over the modern West to diagnose its condition. He categorized the outbreak of the First World War as the undeniable onset of our time of troubles. Much like the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece, it functioned as a massive internal civil war for European civilization. A disintegrating society follows a predictable rhythm, a 3.5-beat cycle of intense crisis followed by a brief rally. The West has tracked this waveform with precision. World War I was the initial crisis. The relative peace of the interwar period served as the brief rally, giving way to the second crisis of World War II. Concurrently, the developing world began behaving exactly like an external proletariat. An educated intelligentsia absorbed Western technologies and ideologies, from Marxism to nationalism, and turned them against their colonial masters. All structural indicators suggest the West is on the established trajectory of collapse, even if total disintegration has not yet finalized. Yet the historical record is not definitive. Western civilization maintains a level of technological dynamism unmatched by any prior society. Its leadership also shows flashes of creative capability. The global abolition of slavery in the 19th century stands as a moral innovation, proving the minority could still execute non-coercive improvements. The expansion of democratic rights to historically excluded demographics proves the society can still generate active mimesis, pulling alienated factions back into the common project. To avoid collapse, the West must pacify the economic and social discontent of its massive working-class internal proletariat. Toynbee proposed a bleak solution. Achieving absolute social justice and material prosperity for the masses will demand extreme technological automation and a mechanization of daily human life. The same inequality and social friction that brought the West to the brink of collapse also provided the high-pressure environment for its greatest inventions. Building a global order that effectively removes those frictions requires a trade-off. If we successfully engineer a world that is perfectly fair and perfectly automated, we remove the very challenges that trigger civilizational growth. In this view, the West might only endure by trading its evolution for a future of permanent, frictionless stasis.